and welcome everyone to our next up MedTech Innovator and BioTools Innovator joint MTI BTI live webinar. For this one, we're going to be talking all about non-dilutive funding. So last week in our respective webinars, we talked about venture capital and how to secure that dilutive funding from our expert VCs. Now we're going to look at the other side of the coin, so the non-dilutive side. And specifically, the question people always ask, which is, what are the strings attached? Surely there's no such thing as free money. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So what do you have to consider as you're going through these processes to both raise this funding to bring it into your company and then to maintain it as well through these funding agencies? So super excited to have an expert panel with us here today to talk about this topic. And so really in this webinar, we're going to be untying this string and unpacking these strategies and pitfalls, how to get in the door with NIH, NSF, DoD, program officers, as well as the roles of warm networking and cold outreach. So we're going to talk about key differences between these funding agencies. What are some hidden terms and conditions in these that could affect your valuation, IP rights, or future M&A opportunities down the road? We'll also talk about how to balance these grants with equity financing as the company grows. So you guys are going to hear all about the SBIR, STTR landscape, including the political and budget impacts that are happening in this current economic climate, how review standards may be changing, as well as timelines and some best practices for your applications. And then finally, we're going to explore some creative approaches to build a sustainable funding pipeline from these federal programs to foundations, corporate partnerships, and other non-dilutive sources of funding. So we believe that with this right strategy, these strings attached will be the ones that bind you to success. So looking forward to hearing from our expert panelists about this topic. So to start things off, we've got Stacy Chin, co-founder and COO at Scout.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today. As Nicole said, I'm Stacy, one of the co-founders of Scout, and we have an AI platform to help founders write high-quality SBIR grants, saving about 70% of your time and effort without jeopardizing the quality. And so our team has raised over $500 million of funding to date, and we bring lots of expertise in this healthcare sector. We're all former PIs, SBIR reviewers, and also past strategists from the larger big. And so we're trying to package that decades of knowledge and bring the best practices and try and deliver that at scale in a SaaS platform. So myself, I have background in as a PhD chemist, turned multi-time founder. I was a PI for an NIH SBR phase 1 and phase 2 application, was a reviewer for NIH and NSF for about 5 years, had my own consulting firm, secured over $40 million of funding, including one of the first large ARPA-H applications and contracts. I have a YouTube channel. So if you type in my name or SBIR, my face will show up somewhere. And I'm looking forward to this panel and helping you guys get some non-dilutive grants.
Thanks for joining us, Stacey. Yeah, she really is the SBIR pro, and I remember some advice she gave. It was like 10 years ago or so at a panel I was at. So really excited to have her here today. Next up, we've got Kirk McElhaney, who's the president at IntelliSpark. Welcome, Kirk.
Hi, thanks. I'm Kirk McElhaney. I run a company called IntelliSpark. I've been doing SBIRs for, I guess, 25 years now. I've personally been involved in 750 funded projects worth a little over $500 million. Got a team of 25 spread across the country. Yeah. And I guess I got started at a startup a long time ago. We did SBIRs. I was part of, I think, 15 funded projects. And then I was like, hey, maybe I could do this as a business. Though I tell everyone, if I knew how little I knew when I started the business, I never would have started the business, because what I could do after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years just gets more and more all the time.
Great. Looking forward to having you, Kirk. That'll be some great insight you'll bring. Next up, we've got Ricky from Redbud Labs. So for our cohorts here, you may remember Ricky from our How to Create a Good Video a webinar that we had at the very beginning of the program. So got him back because he's got so much experience in this space. So welcome, Ricky.
Yeah, good to be here. So I'm at Redbud Labs. We're a life science tools company. So still an operator in a tools business, life science business now. Redbud has done quite a bit of non-dilutive. So we're about 10 to 1 non-dilutive to financial investor capital. And we've done about 30 million of non-dilutive over the kind of life of the company. Primarily NIH SBIR, so that's most of what my exposure has been.
Wow, 30 million. One can only aspire. I know our companies are going to definitely take notes during that. And last but not least, we've got Vineet Nijwawan. Vineet, do you want to introduce yourself? I know we're trying to figure out his camera, but you can at least hear him in his introduction.
Yeah, really sorry about that. I don't understand why my camera is not working. I've never had that issue on Zoom. But anyways, quick background. I have an engineering background. Did startups for 27 years, acquired by Boeing, Motorola, Qualcomm, Mitel, so aerospace and telecom. And then 15 years ago, switched to helping entrepreneurs. That took two directions, teaching at Boston University and investing. And Mass Ventures is the state's venture capital group. We've been around since 1978. The current team's been investing in deep tech over the past 5 years, including in medical devices.
Awesome. And I've been fortunate to know and work with Vineet through many capacities over the past few years. He's a really strong ecosystem supporter here in Boston in particular. So if any of you guys are based in Boston, he's definitely someone to know. So we'll kick things off. So talking about getting in the door, how do you first get these introductions to the folks that are managing these grant programs? So we'll start with you, Stacy. So for these early stage CEOs, what are some best strategies to secure meetings with program officers, reviewers, or grant sponsors as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's important to discuss why is it important to meet with the program officers, right? I think early in my career, I didn't understand the importance of it, but in now realizing how important it is to do this critical step. And this is so you want to make sure your proposal is aligned to the agency's priorities and before you even start writing, right? And these conversations are really powerful because you do want to build a relationship with these program officers. They do have managerial powers behind the scenes. So I have seen proposals that haven't gotten great scores from a review panel that has gotten awarded because they have good relationships with the program officer, for example. So how do you find them, right? There is a list of program officers on the NIH website. If you type in or Google NIH SBR, like program officers or agencies, there's a list of them in there. And I would strongly recommend going in prepared by having a specific aims draft done before you even start engaging with the program officer. And that's just a nice professional way of saying that you prepared yourself and you're ready for a conversation. Typically, if you're going for other applications like a larger ARPA-H federal contract, we strongly recommend to engage with the program officer because that's a little bit of a different game. And usually those that do not engage with the ARPA-H program officer have a very low chance of getting these awarded.
Great advice. Love coming in with specific aims, always being prepared as you get to that. So when it comes to, actually meeting these people, Vineet, for you, how important is warm networking versus cold outreach in connecting with these agencies?
Truthfully, these program managers are very accessible. Their emails are on the websites, and it's their job to respond. So I don't think it's that necessary to have warm introductions. I think you just go ahead and reach out via email, and there's a strong likelihood you'll get a response back within a day or two.
Oh, great advice. And yeah, hopefully that inspires some of you guys to not be shy as you're thinking and identifying people to reach out to in this process. So Kirk, can you share an example of a first meeting that turned into funding and what made this meeting successful? Was it preparation, like Stacy mentioned?
Yeah, so first I would say that a first meeting probably doesn't help you with like an NSF or an NIH SBAR as far as like locking things in. You still have to get through peer review. Where first meetings are most valuable is the Department of Defense. And where you see it's really effective is when you present a technology to a DoD program manager who gets excited about it and actually writes a topic around what you're doing, which then creates a whole pathway that's very narrow. Very few companies can actually submit. So we've had companies, meet a DoD program manager at one of the DoD conferences, present technology, they get excited, they write a topic. There's a very small handful of possible competitors. They win that, win phase one, phase two, and go on from there. So that's generally where that's going to happen.
Great. And so, what should these startups know about pursuing DoD funding at these different levels? So just small contracts versus larger defense programs have different rules for how you should approach it or start strategizing?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest thing when you go to the larger opportunities, like outside of the SBIR space, the important thing to remember is your competitive space has changed. Now you're competing with universities and large companies. And I think, when it comes to grants and contracts, it's like baseball. You have two jobs: hit the ball really hard and don't swing at bad pitches. And some of these opportunities, like you may be nominally open or eligible for, but you're not a viable sort of alternative. And so people get excited because, oh, look, it matches what we do. But the reality that that contract's going to a large university or a big company. So it's really important to figure out like where you can be competitive, because these things are way too much work to go after low probability opportunities.
Yeah, great advice. Look at the whole landscape of who's applying, not just other the
Yeah.
startups as well, and
And
how you
can I
can.
add one more thing about program
Yeah.
officers? I think that it's very easy to get excited what program officers say. But the reality is almost all those conversations end with, hey, this is great. Hope you put a proposal in. You have to understand that their motivations are very different than yours. They are trying to get as many proposals as possible to be able to fund the best technologies. You are trying to figure out if you actually can have a high probability opportunity. So I'm generally more interested in the kinds of questions they ask to show the level of real engagement they have versus the kind of excitement that they have. They have no incentive to say, hey, I would never fund that. At best case, you get mad at them. At worst case, you get mad and call your congressman, and they have a whole crap storm to deal with. So they're always going to be nice and say, hey, great, hope you put something in. So just you have to read between the lines a little bit deeper than just what they say nominally.
Great advice, Kirk. So our company, as I mentioned last week, heard from these VCs about, different types of equity funding as well and how to approach this. So Stacey, my question for you is how should these teams think about balancing grants versus equity funding at different stages of growth? Should a super early stage company think about this spread differently than a later stage company? How would they strategize this?
Yeah, it's a great question and something all startups kind of struggle with. What's the balance between going after equity funding versus grants? And the majority of them are going for both simultaneously, right? Usually, startups at the earlier stages who are still developing that proof of concept, needs those early results, they would more reliably, heavily rely on grants. And it's a great way to de-risk your technical hurdles before approaching investors. Because usually, and not all cases, the investors would either take more ownership early on or may not be interested until you're further along de-risk the technology. But if you are further along, right, and want to focus on speed and scalability, these startups typically lean more heavily on the VC or the equity funding because of the timeline and that they can come in much more easily and not easily, but rather quicker at times than grants.
Yeah, great advice. So, the theme of this panel is obviously the strings attached. So, want to talk a bit about, the flip side of this coin. Obviously, nice to have quote unquote free money if you can, as compared to the giving up equity. But, they're expensive in many different contexts as well. And one of those is a time perspective to actually apply, put this application together, but then also to manage your funding once you've received it. So, Ricky, want to hear from you. What should you consider when determining if it's worth your time to apply?
Yeah. VC ain't free neither.
Good point.
No, there's no free lunch, right? I think um so the costs and maybe we'll talk more about this. You rattled them off. I think they're real. They tend to be front loaded. Like Kirk said, it takes time to write them. It takes a lot of time to write and submit the first one, right? If you've never done it before, you don't have a DUNS and you're not an assist and you kind of have to figure out how all the machinery works, that can be a lift, particularly if you're doing it entirely yourself. And if you're not connected to a university or if you don't have academic founders that have been through that plumbing before. Um, so I think there's a lot of those front-loaded costs. And then of course there's kind of the compliance costs, which at least with NIH, they only tend to get they only become a real inconvenience, I think, later on when the dollar amounts are bigger and you have a little bit more ability to manage them. But I think, look, the way we think about it is we don't want to be doing work that we wouldn't have had to do otherwise. And that's true even in the grant writing, right? So if we're writing a grant the significance section is not just something we make up because we think reviewers want to hear it. We actually do some market research and we try to understand the competitive landscape and we try to understand what is the gap in the industry that we're going to go in and fill, and why are we really well positioned to build something new and interesting, right? So we use that significance section essentially to do the commercial landscaping that you would want to do anyway if you're going to go out and build a product. And the approach is stuff that, 99% of that should be stuff that we really want to be doing internally to develop our own technology or our own product. And so we try to make the formalism of putting the proposal together and running the grant match as closely as possible what we wanted to do operationally anyway. I think the other comment about this is different kinds of funds. So, there's no free money and there's no free lunch. Different kinds of funds are good for different kinds of things. So I think everyone understands that venture capital is really designed to fund hypergrowth. There's other kinds of venture capital on the margins, like funds that will fund other things before or after that, or leading up to that. But really, what venture capital is designed to fund is hypergrowth. And for a tools business, it's very rare to find a tools business that goes through hypergrowth. And tools businesses tend to have a lot of R&D expense. Grants are really good at funding R&D. And so you just need to look at the work that needs to happen in your organization. The expense of getting the proposal written and getting it out the door is more worth it if the activities that it funds are things that you absolutely have to do. And if the other kinds of financing that are out there aren't available or aren't a good fit for the kind of work that you have to do. And so when you're early in the company life cycle, often it's the financing mechanism that works better.
Yeah, that's great advice, and really love thinking about, how the proposal can even be beneficial for your other goals, outlining your potential customers, your value proposition, and your technical milestones in a more refined way. So Kirk, would love to hear your feedback on this.
There's one more thing about time, and it's not just the time it takes the proposal, it's actually the time it takes you to get your product to market. This whole process is brutally slow. So if you do a SBIR phase 1, phase 2, typical process is 4.5 to 5 years to do that. And a lot of people think they're being clever, saving 10% of their equity by getting a bunch of non-dilutive funding. But the reality is you have finite patent life, and most products have a 5 to 7 year product cycle. If you waste 3 or 4 years early on, yeah, you own 10% more, but it's worth half or 3/4 less than it otherwise would be. So you have to understand like what you're trading it off for. And generally, like I've had companies have billions of dollars in exits. The number that did it solely with non-dilutive funding, 0. So if you want to try that, I'll bet my house against you. My wife will be mad today, but she'll be happy in a few years because you're going to lose. You cannot move at the speed you need to, and grants don't cover everything. So you have to understand what you're trading it for. And sometimes, ultimately grants are a means to an end, and it's really allowing you to de-risk yourself to bring in better money. If you get a VC term sheet for $30 million at a great valuation, like take that, ignore this, and just keep going.
Great advice.
Yeah, I think one other thing, like I said, those costs are front loaded, and they're particularly front loaded on the first grant. And so I think the other kind of mirror image of Kirk's comment is, if you're going to build the machine internally, operationally, to write one grant, you might as well apply for 10. And so, you're going to have those lead times, you're going to have those cycle times, you're going to have the whatever you learn, the muscle memory of getting the thing submitted. And so just writing one and sending it out is, I think, of limited value if you're not saying this is going to be part of our financing strategy and we're going to build a machine to do it 5, 10 times, 10 times with some award rate.
Yeah, really good point, Ricky. So obviously these time considerations are huge, just for both for applying, and then as Kirk was saying, for your milestones and overall timeline to market. But there's some other lesser known terms and conditions that could come into play in these non-dilutive awards that could materially impact your valuation or maybe an eventual exit as well. So Kirk, do you have any examples of this in terms you've seen?
Yeah, generally it becomes problematic with an active grant, and there are 2 scenarios that are problematic. So one is you're getting acquired by a large company who really doesn't want the grant. So like I had a company bought by Microsoft, and they're like, worked really hard to get this like $4 million grant, and they're like, we don't want it. It's just a hassle for us. and get out of it, or they wouldn't do the acquisition. Um, if it's a smaller company, they may be hoping to get the grant and they might be including that as the price. But it's important to understand transferring the grant to the new entity, the government has to consent to that. And they may or they may not, depending upon what they feel about the organization. So I do have one example where that was the plan, and NIH said no, thank you. And all of a sudden, the agreed upon price suddenly became very contentious, and the deal almost fell apart for that reason. So it gets complicated at the end if you have active grants. And as a totally unrelated note, there are some things that may be occurring due to what's called the Innovate Act, which is a terrible bill that's in the Senate right now, that will create some long-term clawback provisions if you ever do things in a country of concern, aka China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. So, like potentially moving manufacturing to China in the future from an SBIR related technology could potentially create a clawback provision, which I think will have a huge negative impact on mergers and acquisitions of technologies driven by SBIRs.
Wow, that's really helpful insight. We're seeing in our cohort now folks getting denied SBIR grants, just even on the basis of having, contractors, CROs based in other countries, or maybe even advisors in their company. So good to know that that clawback could exist in the future retroactively as well for some of these grants, something to consider. So Vineet, want to hear from you. So have you seen a situation where taking a grant actually reduced a company's attractiveness to either to investors or future acquirers?
Yeah, just to step back a bit, and I will answer the question. So we have portfolio companies who've been very good at raising equity financing, but terrible at getting grants. And then we've had other companies that are good at both, like getting grants and equity financing. We do have a number of, because we offer these SBR matching grants. So we do have a whole bunch of portfolio companies that have never raised any equity funding, are basically just, subsisting off of grants. I will say that mostly non-dilutive grants are a good signal for equity investors. Um, I do have one portfolio company that's very good at getting grants. And sometimes as an equity holder in the company and being on the board, I find that while they're good at getting grants, not all the grants are completely aligned with the direction an equity owner would like to see the company go in. And the grants can be a distraction. And of course, the management says, no, 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 no. Here the reason is not a distraction. We've got to do this kind of work anyways. And even though this is, in a completely different field, it'll help evolve our technology. I I rarely find that to be true.
Really good advice. I give that advice to startups a lot in considering, going back to Kirk's point as well about timeline delays. So, owning 50% equity in a company that's worth 100,000 is still a heck of a lot less than 10% in a $5 million company. So how do you, make amends with the increased valuation results of taking this equity, and are these grants, worth it at the end of the day? So, yeah, going back to also potential M&A concerns, investor concerns. Have you seen anything, or overall a positive view from investors?
Was that for me again?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yes. I would say that it's neutral. Um,
Okay.
I really don't think for M&A events that having non-dilutive grants moves the needle one way or the other. I would say for a very and we mainly invest in very early stage companies, academic spin-outs particularly. Having a non-dilutive grant, I think, is quite positive for us. So we actually look for companies that have gone and got an SBIR grant, because just going through the peer review and frankly just going through the process of writing the grant, uh, you know, makes you think beyond your technology and makes you think about the business, and then having the peer review on the technology, I think is a great signal for us.
Yeah, great. Great to hear. So
I think I
thinking,
would add on that is it's
yes.
really important early stage investment because if you look what's happened in the VC community, they've really shifted away from early stage investments over the last 15 to 20 years, and that gap's been filled by much smaller VC firms or angel investors, and they don't have the scientific sophistication to validate your science. Let's say you're doing, I don't know, a drug for prostate cancer. They might be a great team, great market, but I have no idea if your molecule's any good. And they're kind of being able to rely on that NIH peer review to say, okay, the science is good. It kind of helps de-risk them in the investment process.
Oh, great. Great reason why, this can be helpful is external folks actually validating this through their process as well, kind of like having peer review as part of it. So good point, Kirk. So are there any other like funding terms, like especially around intellectual property rights that could trap startups in some way, or maybe cause them to, not file IP in an ideal manner in the future?
Well, I think the biggest thing to understand is if the government funds R&D that leads to generation of new IP, they have the right to use that IP for free forever, which sounds terrible. Now, that's the same condition every university operates under. So if you're using university technology, you already have that problem. I think there's a couple important things, though. One, there's only a very, very few instances of the government actually using those rights. I think mostly they don't want to tell the taxpayers they spend 100 billion plus on R&D and get nothing in return. Um, but if they do use their rights, that probably means that like your company's a dumpster fire anyway. You got bigger problems on your hands. But maybe more importantly, if you're smart, you can create a pretty obvious mitigation strategy. So I like to use the analogy of like building a car. So I wanted the government to pay for all the R&D to go into a modern car. One thing I would do is make sure that no government dollar touch some critical component, let's say the wheel. Let them pay for engines, transmissions, and everything else that goes into a car. This is also important why you should raise money. But there's one important part that no government dollar touches. That way, no matter what, even if they want to use their rights, they still have to go through me, so I protected myself.
Great advice. So Ricky, want to hear from you. You guys have raised, 30 million non-dilutive funding. So how do these different types of grants, SBIR, BARDA, DARPA, shape the strategic decision making for these startups? So have your milestones shifted as a result of receiving these grants, or has your course stayed the same since you've worked them into your trajectory?
Yeah, so I think Minette, you made a point before that I'll drill into here. Strategy should drive grants, not the other way around, right? You develop your company's plan, you figure out what your core assets are, what markets you're going after, what customer problems you're going to solve, how you're going to build enterprise value, what the exit is, like all the stories that you need to put together to have a good plan to build a company. And then as part of that plan, you say, what's my financing strategy? And then as part of that financing strategy, you're going to say what portion of that might be non-dilutive. And so you tend to run into the problems when it's describing where you get distracted or you start chasing squirrels when you start with the grants and then try to back your way into a strategy. And I think the management team, the board retains control over strategy if you start there and always derive the financing plan and the grants plan in that order, kind of whether it's, year to year or quarter to quarter, but coming back and saying what is our actual strategy. So having said that, we do a bunch of things to have a clear picture of that. Um, I think understanding what the applications of the technology are, understanding where you think the opportunities are. If you suddenly see a call or you see some opportunity to go write a proposal that tackles something that's new and interesting out there, and you have the bandwidth to go do it, even if it's further down the road, absolutely go grab that when it makes sense in the overall strategy. I think some planning around kind of what are those different applications, who are the potential funders for it. That's down in the plumbing of the grants strategy once you've already done the higher levels of strategy. So I think once you're down into it, then you can say, who are the right funders, who are the right institutes, which program officers should I go find and build relationships with.
Right. Yeah, maybe you could share some examples, Ricky, of specific grants you got and milestones that you accomplished as part of this that maybe were even inspired by the grant or you helped craft for it that ended up being really useful or fit into your strategy overall.
Well, so I'll give you an example that's top of mind right now. Actually, we did uh, an SBIR contract. We've done one contract in all these years. Most of them were grants. You're really down in the weeds once you start to worry about the distinction between the two. But we did get one of these contracts, and it's been a complete success. Like we hit all the milestones. The PO loves us. Like we're the only contract awardee in the history of NIH, as far as I can tell, that actually did everything that we said that we were going to do. Um, we've got customers using the product in the space that they wanted this product to go, and it's eligible for a phase 2B, which is one of these subsequent, like post phase 2, and get some matching funds. And there's some interesting questions around what's the right use of funds. And you can read the description of what a phase 2B says, but then you can also look at like what we have to go do in selling our product. So we're out on the market now with our instrument, and the way you sell an instrument in our space, it's very application driven. You want to be able to find kind of model systems, collect some data in a specific user application. You want to be able to show them that app note when you're going through the sales process. And so we're trying to figure out how to write a proposal that puts those two things together, where the phase 2B is basically a description of all of the opportunities we see with the thing that the contract paid for us to build, and it's the funding for us to go out and actually develop that application data in collaboration with our customers. So it's exactly what we want to do in order to build a market for this product and build the kind of commercial footprint for the product. But it's a good fit also for this phase 2B mechanism, which is kind of a later stage commercialization focused award.
Great. I'd love to hear from you guys too, Kirk, Stacy, Vineet, if you guys have examples of specific milestones that were worked into a grant application that, maybe the startup didn't initially consider. Maybe they were really academic and this was pushing them toward commercialization or something else that helped to actually craft their strategy moving forward. So maybe Kirk, we'll start with you.
So I guess I'd say one thing, which is not quite what you're asking, but a different thing. I think that a lot of people, when they approach their first SBIR, their view is, I want to get this phase 1. I want to make maximal progress towards my MVP. And maybe they win that phase 1, but those people seldom win a phase 2. Because that's actually not what a phase 1 is supposed to do. What a phase 1 is supposed to do, it's like, here's a small pile of money, prove to me I should give you a big pile of money. So oftentimes you're better off making a throwaway prototype to collect an important data piece to de-risk the underlying technology, which is far more than making maximal progress. And so, like, understanding the game that you're playing is a really important part of this. In phase 1, the only thing you're trying to do in phase 1 is win a phase 2. Because if all you do is win a phase 1, you can call your mom and she'll be proud of you, but it doesn't matter for your company. Because like if you're doing anything interesting, you don't need $300,000, you need $30 million. And so if you don't win a phase 2, like honestly, don't even bother.
Great advice.
Yeah, my experience, I've also been a reviewer for many SBIR panels. And what I found, and it's interesting, these were mainly for NIH, though I've done NSF as well. In most of these panels, I think I was the only non-PhD in the room. And I always wondered why they invited me back. But is the thing that differentiates really good SBIR proposals from so-so ones are ones that bring signals of market need, if I may put it in that way. So, for example, support letters, even like we managers provide support letters all the time to companies as for their SBIR proposals. And the letter is very clear. There's nothing binding in the letter. But the letter says, hey, we're in the business of giving money to these kind of startups. And if this startup gets the SBIR funding and actually says what they're going to do, obviously we're going to look at it as a potential equity investment. You'd be amazed at how much impact that has to these reviewers, because a lot of the reviewers are PhDs who don't absolutely have no idea of how to bring things to market. And when they see letters like this, it elevates in their mind that this proposal actually is thinking about commercialization because that's the goal of the program.
Yeah, great advice. Get
And
get
one
those
more
letters from
thing here.
KOLs.
Yeah, if I can add one more thing here, Nicole, we also work with a lot of like excellent, brilliant, like scientists, engineers from the top universities, like PhD in Harvard and all these hospitals too, right? What I find trips up mostly first-time entrepreneurs is that this is a commercialization proposal, right? SBRs are all about commercialization. It's not about developing some sort of technology and proving it with through scientific experiments. And so the way you want to structure specific aims in your strategy is to develop something and then to prove that it's better than what's currently out there, right? We want to fund new innovations that is better than the current standard, whether it's faster, cheaper, higher efficacy that way. I've seen a lot of people developing med devices and say, hey, we want to propose to develop a new technology, and that's it. Or we want to prove this in an animal study. And they forget the last question is why, right? And so the way for me, it was a mind shift coming out of grad school towards this role of how do I the market need and figure out how to prepare my aims based on the market or clinical need versus just preparing more experiments for a peer-reviewed journal or an article.
Yeah, great way to think about aims and structuring it around, competitive analysis too. Maybe you're not doing the standard controls that you would do for your PhD, but you're controlling against other devices already on the market, other procedures that may be standard of care at the moment. And what does that look like for your competitive differentiation and your overall value proposition in the market? So I'll bring it back to why is this commercially viable and how can you de-risk it to make it so? So wrapping up the final strings attached set of questions, I'd like to hear from you, Kirk, because you have a lot of experience on the DoD end. So how do you balance the allure of these large DoD dollars with the risk of becoming maybe dependent on these contracts as a company?
Well, I think it's whether it's DoD or anywhere else, the risk of becoming dependent is always a problem. Grants and contracts are like morphine. They're great if they're used in the right place, but if they're not, you become a junkie in a gutter. And if you become a perpetual grant mill, like that's a company going nowhere. Yes, you can make a little money doing it, but you're really wasting a national resource and doing nothing. So you're in my mind the same category as a junkie. So every time you get a grant or contract, you should ask yourself like, how is this, you know, furthering the company's objectives? And really, you should actually be saying, I want to get X funded, then finding a home for it versus saying, oh, here's a grant I can do. Um, and, especially with the DoD, there's always stuff you don't want to do usually because they'll have some weird spec and you'll be like, okay, great, I want to do 80% of this and 20% weird stuff that they want to do. That's probably fine. But if it's 30% you want to do and 70% stuff you don't want to do, like just run away as fast as you can.
Great advice. So I think summary here is keep your milestones aligned, maybe take some inspiration for how you can create better milestones that are commercially relevant and pushing you toward that final goalpost, and you can avoid those strings. So moving into our last set of questions, for those of you on LinkedIn, if you have any questions for the panelists, please drop those in the event comments. Our amazing Gabby on our marketing team is going to get me those on the side the last 5 minutes or so. So would love to tackle your questions since this is live and we want to utilize that aspect. For our MedTech Innovator and BioTools Innovator cohorts listening, please drop your questions in that Q&A box. And then after this hour is done, we will swap to those for you guys. So talking about the general landscape, as many people listening know, it's been a bit tumultuous to say the least, both in terms of amount of funding and review cycle times, and also sources of funding as well. So a lot of uncertainty in general. So would like to hear at least first from you, Vineet, about what's new in this SBR STTR space. Have these political or budget cycles really changed timelines or reward expectations?
Yeah, I mean, to be truthful, we probably have just anecdotal data, amongst our portfolio companies. And it's funny, I just came from a site visit for a grant. So we provide START grants. These are grants given to Massachusetts entities that have received a phase two SBIR. Um, and, as part of the grant, we do site visits. I was just with a medical device company doing a site visit, and their phase 2B with NIH just got released. And it took a little bit longer, but so anecdotally, what we've been hearing is that everybody who's got SBR grants, their money is flowing. We haven't heard of anybody who's had it canceled. It may be delayed, but it is flowing.
That's good to hear.
Um, um, Now, SBR, the actual legislation, I don't think is under threat. I think there's bipartisan support for the SBIR program. Now, remember, it's a percentage of the funding of these agencies. DoD is the only agency that had its funding increased in this last bill of the agencies that are big SBIR grantees. So NIH and SF are both been proposed to be cut, but it's not over yet. So Congress is still working on that. We'll know hopefully by the end of September, exactly where NIH and NSF end up.
Great. Well, we're all crossing our fingers for that.
Yeah, so on that
Yeah.
note, like obviously the headline is all you hear about is like NIH cut by 40%, NSF cut by 40%. Remember, that's the president's budget requests. Presidential budget requests have always been and will always be political theater. So the best example I can use is you go back to the last Trump administration, their last year, they asked for $7 billion for NSF. Congress gave them $9 billion. In Biden's last year of his administration, he asked for $11 billion for NSF. Congress gave him $9 billion. So Democratic presidents tend to ask for more, they'll get. Republicans tend to ask for less, that they'll get. The initial signs of what's in committee, NIH seems like it's going to be pretty safe, may even get a small increase. The Senate wants to keep NSF where they're at, but the House is asking for an 18% cut. So the range of outcomes is not going to be a 40% cut. It's going to be somewhere between staying flat and maybe losing 8 to 18%. So it won't be as bad as the headlines. And even if there is cuts, remember, the government spends an enormous amount of money. Enormous amount of money minus 10% is still an enormous amount of money.
Yeah. And also to add there too, yes, everyone's nervous about the cuts, right? And we're seeing our clients kind of hold back a little bit saying, I'm really nervous about that. But then the clients that we are helping that are moving forward are actually now getting things awarded. So this is still a game we still have to push through. I think we've all seen turmoil like this in the past as well too. And those that actually persist and continue to go for grant funding, despite these delays, are the ones that are winning out. We are keeping a close eye as well too on the reauthorization bill that should pass through hopefully end of September. Right now, each agency is required to allocate at least 3.2% of the budget. We're seeing that both sides of the parties are bullish in passing this new authorization bill, which will make the SBIR program won't need to renew it, and we might even see the increase from 3.2 to 7% per agency. So it's not that the government is like woo-woo about new innovations. They do support new innovations. We just have to figure out what that alignment looks like next month when that's come through.
Great. Well, that's encouraging. So even though there is some uncertainty, hopefully everyone realizes the benefit of these innovations for the overall economy and our health, of course, as a country, being that we're all medtech biotools startups. But given there is still like a bit of uncertainty, Stacey, like how should these companies plan around this? Is there something they should put into their strategy in addition?
Yeah. Diversity is going to be the name of the game, right? And just kind of going hard in terms of going and exploring both non-dilutive side, whether it's grants, SBIR, foundational nonprofits, or even just on the equity side, right? Again, like those that are holding back on the grants, you're missing the boat of when these do become awarded down the road. And so we're just seeing a lot of companies are just diversifying more, looking at different grant opportunities, even within SBIR program, trying to go harder on quality and also look at different opportunities across the board to see what makes sense as well.
Great. Kirk, any advice that you have for this? Planning around this?
Yeah, I think it goes back again to raise private money as well. If you have your own money, you can control your own timing. And, If the grant comes in, then you just shift the private money into the next thing that's beyond that cycle. But you don't get caught in sort of hold mode because the grant didn't come through. So if you have both private money and public money, you can really optimize your schedule and get to market really fast.
Great. Ricky, what have you guys done to prepare, and how do you think about these priorities shifting, especially within the tools landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you raise the money you can when you can, and it kind of doesn't matter which funder we're talking about. And so if you have a story and your company's at a stage when you can raise private capital, you go do that. If you have a story and you're at a stage and your technology is a good fit that you think you're competitive for grants, you should go do that. I think the broader landscape budgets are probably going to come down. The number of applications is going to not go down. Whether it goes up, I don't know, but it's going to be harder. It's going to be more competitive. That's not great if you really want grants to be a big part of your financing strategy going forward. But it's also better than, like, fighting for that is better than them not being there or not trying to go get that source of capital if it's a good fit for your business. So sometimes it's easier than others. Sometimes it's harder than others. I think at the end of the day, the best you can do is lay out your company strategy and say, what are the plausible sources of funding, and then go fight for all the ones that are plausible, kind of metering your time in ratio to the potential dollars times the probability of getting them.
Yeah, risk benefit analysis around this to start. Great advice.
So I want to add one more thing, if you don't mind as well. We're also
Course.
seeing some, like, maybe not this population, but some biotech companies as well too, in biopharma. Investors are asking, are you applying for SBIR grants as well too? So it kind of goes both ways. They kind of don't, we're finding it's harder and harder to get some of these med tech and healthcare proposals or VC funded because they're looking for companies that are further along. So they're asking and keeping an eye if you do have a non-dilutive strategy. So I think it's more important than ever, especially like everyone resonates here. Diversity is always going to be the best thing at this time.
Yeah, great to hear, and good that VCs are interested in seeing this. We heard from them last week as well that they're optimistic about the climate around this. So hopefully keeps coming in. So
And I'm
yeah.
sure that on the investor panel, what they said is, oh, if it's bad time or if you don't have the right story, like, go get some grants. And then you come to this one and they say, well, you
Yeah,
got to make sure that you're also applying for private capital. And that's the story, right?
two
There's
sides of the
no
exact
easy way
same
to do
coin.
this,
Yeah.
right? There's no
Need
easy way
those
to do it.
coins.
And, tools, devices, diagnostics, they are really hard to finance. And I think it's important to say that out loud. And I think it's important for entrepreneurs, for people who are trying to build these companies, to be like, we got to be candid with one another about it. It is really hard to raise capital of any kind for these businesses. And so you look at the menu, you look at the table, and you say, none of this is easy. None of this is stuff I want to go do. But those are the choices that are available. The only alternative is to go start a company in AI, and God bless them.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So now I want to talk a bit about, actually going after these grants. So writing them and assembling them, which is no easy task, as we've talked about, quite a time commitment. And maybe I'll actually start out with Vineet for this, because you've been on the reviewer end of many of these grants. So maybe a neutral party, and then we'll move to Ricky and Stacy that have obviously taken different approaches with this. So is paying for a professional grant writer worth it for early teams, or should startups prioritize learning in-house and writing their milestones, their grants entirely in-house? So, Vinny, having read these, what are your thoughts on the differences and where startups can prioritize their time?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with grant writers, um, and how much time they can save, the principals. I just don't know. Maybe Stacy can answer that. But we generally do not recommend grant writing services. Truthfully, because we provide so many non-dilutive grants, we get a lot of demand from our companies for grant writing help, which we don't provide. We possibly can't. Um, we've actually thought about hiring a full-time grant writer in our own uh, organization, sort of, to provide that kind of help to these companies, but not on a paid basis. We haven't followed through on that yet. Um, it's I remember even in academia, Nicole, you probably understand. I mean, academics are constantly writing grants, and you almost can't outsource this to someone else. Only you really know your own technology and your own business to be able to express it in a way that's going to differentiate yourself from others. So, I'm hesitating a bit here because I have not seen examples where grant writers have increased the probability of grant getting, but it's hard to know, right? Unless you do a clinical trial with, you know, it's hard to know whether they have an impact or not.
Yeah. Interesting. So jury's out, but Stacey, I'd love to hear from you. You've obviously seen a lot of success with Scout and the grant writing you guys have been doing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I would resonate what Denise said too. As a founder in PI, this is your proposal, right? You should be in the driver's seat. You know your technology, your go-to-market, and your strategy is the best, right? And so we're working with a grant writer. I've been doing it for 10 years. Our goal is to figure out how to extract that information from you and then kind of massage it in a way that will be perceived well to the reviewers, right? And it takes a lot of time. Like usually writing one SBI application takes around 60 to 70 hours. I'm sure Ricky and Kirk can also resonate to that too. It's time commitment and it's an investment, right? And these are really competitive where stars can have anywhere from like a 10 to 15 shot of getting this the first time around. So there's an art of how to put together an SBI application that people have seen, over and over and over and over again, can kind of tell you whether or not you're in the right direction or not. Um, and so if you do go for a great writer, you want to make sure you have a team with a successful record and someone that's working with you and actually cares about what you're doing and actually is investing time in you to craft your narrative, right? I personally don't think you can chat GPT an application. That's just not how SBR applications work. I've seen so much junk that's out there and it's absolutely horrible. But things in this space, right? It's all about quality and the quality comes with cost, right? And so I think that's kind of some of the pain points we're trying to address here at Scout is how can we take AI, transform and just speed up the time to write that without just chat GPTing everything. And we have it in a way where, we can still write high quality applications, touch point with SBR experts, while you as the PI and the founder still stays in the driver's seat. And so we have a way just to accelerate your efforts with AI properly. Fabrication of data is a big no-no. We want to make sure everything still, has that flair of what reviewers are looking for. And that's really, really important. But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, great advice. And Ricky, what's the approach you guys have taken?
Yeah, so maybe for context, it's helpful to know where we came from. So we spun out of UNC Chapel Hill. My co-founders were faculty at UNC, ran a P41. Like they knew how to write NIH grants, knew how to, work inside of the plumbing of NIH. And so when we started writing our first SBIRs, my job was to write the research plan, right? And they were able to give me feedback and direction on the grantsmanship aspects of writing a strong proposal. And then they could get us set up in terms of the kind of structural stuff for being able to submit. So I don't want to gloss over the amount of effort that takes. We did it ourselves. And having started doing it ourselves, we've continued to do it entirely ourselves. We have occasionally hired full-time or part-time grant writers in-house, but we've never gone to a third-party grant writer. I will say I've talked to entrepreneurs who have gone to grant writing shops and I think been glad they did particularly because of that structural stuff. Like, what am I even doing here? They're writing their first grant. They kind of don't know what it means to write a good one, what logistically they need to do in order to submit on time. And so I think, the shops out there that do this for a living can give you the checklist and kind of make sure that you're staying on task. So I can see a lot of value in that. I think there's a few there's a few things to keep in mind. I we use contractors for we don't use them for grants. We do use them for other things, right? We use them for engineering. We've used them for industrial design. We've used them for um, digital outbound because we didn't have kind of the skills in-house or we wanted to learn something before we kind of committed to a direction. And so one of the things I always say is if we're going to go hire a contractor, we need to learn how to do their job along the way. Like we really need to understand what makes them successful, and we should be kind of bringing those skills on board and in-house. And so in general, I feel like if we're consistently using a contractor to do something over an extended period of time, we're probably going to hire someone to do it internally, or one of us is just going to learn how to do it and do it ourselves. And I think that mentality, even if it doesn't come to pass or we do it for a little while and we say we don't need that anymore, I think that mentality puts us in the right place of kind of owning the process and owning the outcome, even if we're going to someone externally. And so ultimately, it's like know your strengths, like know what you're
Yeah.
good at. I find it really helpful for us to be good at the storytelling, to be accountable for ourselves, to be accountable to the process, make sure that we're following our checklists that work for our business, not some checklist that's designed just to get grants. I think that's been really valuable for us. But at the end of the day, it's like know your strengths, know what your company needs, and make a decision that allows you to execute quickly.
Great. So it sounds like really depends on who's on the team. So, we talked about how academics are writing grants all the time in the academic world. So then coming into a startup comes maybe a little more naturally to them. But, alongside this, I've heard the question a lot, and I know you have too, Ricky, like, do you need a PhD to write a successful grant application? Or should someone with a PhD be involved in this process in some way? So maybe Kirk, you can give some color on this and
Well,
what
I
you
don't
think.
have a PhD and I've touched 750 funded projects, so no, you don't. Like my general opinion is, it's really the smarts in the person, not how long they stay in school. Now, you sort of put a floor under people because of the PhD. You have to have a certain floor, but lots of people don't go down that pathway who are more than capable of doing that. I want to go back to your last question. One, I've always hated the term grant writer. Um, and I think that's why maybe most people shouldn't use grant writers because the grant writer is just writing down what you say and doesn't really bring a lot else to the table. Um, I think there's a lot of other things that are happening here. One, like, so can you beat me and my team? Absolutely not. And like, for instance, like I own 9% of NSF's entire portfolio. All right. You give me the same technology. I'm doing this all day, every day for 25 years. And 25 years ago, I had a basic observation. If I could do enough volume, I could collect enough reviews and prior proposals to actually learn characteristics of individual review panels. The government uses the same reviewers over and over again. So I have insights in how reviewers think that you're not going to have. And so I can take your story and you're going to say, I want to do A, B, and C. I'm going to say, absolutely not. You're going to do A, B, and D, and F. And we're going to sell your story differently. And we're going to move your project over to here versus there. And so a grant writer, not that helpful. But someone, I call it the old funding strategist because there's a whole new level. If all you're doing is helping write the grant, that's often some random postdoc who's doing something on the side. Like, yeah, they're not adding any value. But the notion that it's like anything else, like, I mean, you can basically beat somebody who spends their entire life doing it. Probably not.
Great advice. So we actually got a lot of questions from LinkedIn I want to tackle, but one topic first we didn't touch on is beyond this SBIR, STTR landscape. So Vinny, you work with Mass Ventures, so would like to hear from you. What are some other non-dilutive opportunities outside of these traditional SBIR, STTR mechanisms that these startups should be pursuing, maybe in parallel?
Yeah, so all states are starting to step up with new funding pots to counter the federal government pulling back. So you probably saw in Massachusetts, the governor announced this new $400 million pot of money. It's divided into 200 and 200, plus a nonprofit that they're setting up where corporations and individuals can donate. Um, and 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 this is predominantly focused at academic research commercialization and research too, frankly. It's still a work in progress. The legislature still has to pass it. Um, they're also, again, I know Massachusetts is better than anywhere else, but every state usually has an economic development agency or many. In our case, I think Massachusetts has something like 21 um, economic development agencies, which can be a little bit difficult sometimes navigating, though the current administration has just launched something called Business Front Door. And the idea is that you can come in through this front door and people will help you navigate which quasi-public state agency you want to get to. Specifically, the two or three agencies I think that one should look at. We have uh, both clean tech as well as SBIR matching grants. We, as in Mass Ventures, um, Mass Clean Energy Center has clean tech grants, many different types, and their funding is going up. Mass Life Sciences Center has grants, their funding is flat to going down. And Mass Tech Collaborative has grants around advanced manufacturing, semiconductor stuff. So um, definitely lots of sources of state grant funding. Foundations, more likely in the health space. So there are, many disease foundations out there that do fund early stage companies. They're a bit of work to understand them, but there are sites, that can help you navigate, who these are. So, for example, at Boston University, we subscribe to a software program called Pivot, which allows you to look, to see which grants are more applicable to you and not. Um, we at Mass Ventures have actually built a custom software platform for our portfolio companies that just trolls all federal grants. And you know, you can get it from the federal granting sites, but we scrape those and allow you to easily find and search for federal grants. Um, so I would say it's a little bit of work, but uh, there are other sources of non-dilutive grants other than the federal government.
Yeah, great advice. And yeah, maybe you can drop a link to that pivot program in the chat for the cohort. I'm sure they'd love to explore that. Awesome. So got some questions on LinkedIn. So hope you guys don't mind a couple more minutes of the live portion, just so we can tackle these. So one that says, for early stage medtech founders building hardware enabled platforms, where have you seen the most traction in securing capital? Traditional VC and angel networks, or strategic partnerships with development firms that offer integrated support across prototyping, regulatory, and manufacturing? And how do you weigh that against time and uncertainty of pursuing non-dilutive grants like NIH or BARDA? So I
Yeah.
guess we're
Yeah, for me, it comes back to, what is your company strategy? Like, what is your company's plan? What are your key milestones? Where are you in product development? What are the value creating kind of, those points on the step function where your enterprise value jumps up? And at each step along the way, how much capital do you need? And what are the plausible sources of that capital? Because if you want to do activities, between here and here, if you need to do activities A, B, and C, and those are activities that when you go talk to investors, they say, we don't fund those activities. The conversation is very short, right? And if you go look for non-dilutive capital and you say, I want to do A, B, and C, and the funder says, well, we don't do that, then the conversation is very short. Don't write the proposal and don't send it in. So it has to come. It's company strategy first, and then there's financing strategy downstream of that, and then start doing the work to actually go get the money.
Great advice. Thanks, Ricky. Other question we had is, for pure R&D phase 1, is NSF better than NIH? Anyone have an opinion on this?
That's not something you can answer. It depends upon the company. Some companies are better suited to NIH, some are better suited to NSF. I would say generally, NSF will take on more risk. They like more technical risk. NIH wants to see you further along, more preliminary data. NSF will not touch anything that requires you to do a clinical trial as part of the project, which means any kind of intervention, whereas NIH may, depending upon where NIH you're going. It's very much depends upon the company. So without knowing the company, it's hard to say. But in many cases, like, you're going to try both. And in that case, you have two choices. You can do what I call two shots on goal. You craft one project, send it to both agencies. But if they both want to fund it, if you turn one of them down, otherwise you get to go to prison, which is not probably the desired outcome. Or you split the project into two unique projects that have separate work, but you have to be careful about that because it's actually not that hard to take one good project and chop it in half into two piles of crap that are both unfundable. For some companies, they're better off doing two shots on goal. They're more like a tree. We have to build a trunk first, and then you can branch out from there. Others can actually split relatively early. So it depends on what's right for you.
Okay. Great answer. And then we already tackled this one a bit already. So maybe again, back to you, Kirk, probably, but if funding is cut by 40%, at the federal level, how do you expect that to impact NIH or NSF?
Okay, so whatever happens at NIH, if there's a cut, it'll be worse than it actually the headline sounds. So NIH is different than NSF in the fact that it mortgages its future. So when NSF funds a phase two, it only pays for the first year and then promises to pay for the other years in the future, which means in most years, 45 to 50% of NIH budget is pre-allocated. So you can imagine if you spent 50 and you lose 40, then things are really, really bad. Now, I think they're going to end up with a flat budget in the end. NSF, when they fund a phase two, they pay for it all up front. So they don't have any pre-existing commitments. So that whatever the impact is will actually be not as bad as it is at NIH. But I don't expect NIH to get a cut when it's all said and done. We've seen the Senate's version and early versions of the House's version in committee seem to want to keep NIH flat. NSF may take a cut though.
Great. And then last question from LinkedIn. So it's chicken and egg problem of needing this STTR, SBIR funding for legitimacy to secure VC funding, and vice versa, potentially for accelerators competitions to need these for SBIRs. They see this as a real problem. So how do you advise these startups to compete for funding now that less funding in general and both sides of the coin is available?
Well, the reality is, and I've been doing startups for more than 40 years, there's always more demand for capital than supply of capital. It's just the nature of the business. And not everybody is going to get funded. It doesn't matter whether it's non-dilutive or dilutive. So I don't think there's an easy answer. In these macro downturns where private capital pulls back a bit, government capital should step in, and that's what we've been doing here at the state. The federal government sometimes is not as wieldy. Right now, we've got the federal government pulling back, and we've got the private sector pulling back. And when I say the private sector is pulling back, the venture firms have raised more money than they have in the history of venture, right? So it's not like the venture firms aren't flush with money. They're all worried about supporting existing portfolio companies because they're not getting exits. And if they don't get exits, they can't raise their next fund. So we're kind of this weird thing where it's just stuck. And it just takes a couple of good IPOs to break it wide open. So, we may not be having this conversation 6 months from now. The private sector could open up again, but there is no easy answer. I mean, not everybody's going to get funded.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think that, part of the problem is way too much money was in VC funds in 2022, 23, invested in startups at valuations that they should not have invested in. Those startups hired people at salary bases they should not have hired them at, and so the whole cost structures are skewed. And so now keeping those companies alive is very challenging. And so, I've been doing this 25 years. I've seen bad VC markets. I've seen bad government markets. First time they've actually sort of intertwined at the same time, which is super unideal. And people come to me sometimes and I'm like, you don't have enough data to be competitive. And they're like, well, isn't that what the grant's supposed to do? Theoretically, yes, but this is free money, and like whoever's got the best, it's a competitive bar. Your peers set the bar, not some imaginary thing of what you need. So it's like getting into MIT. If MIT says you need a 3.5, but everyone shows up with a 3.9, well, you better have a 3.9 too, otherwise you're not getting it.
I think
Right. Go ahead, Ricky.
Go ahead, Stacy.
Okay. And I just want to make one quick, how you pitched your startup towards a grant or an SBIR application is completely different compared to how you pitch it to a VC or a different investor. We have lots of excellent and really brilliant PhDs, scientists, engineers like going for after SBIR grants. But when checking out their pitch decks, it has to be completely revised, right? So we're also trying to help them as well to just figure out, hey, this is not how you exactly do a pitch deck, or how do you present to investors as well too. And it's a completely different skill set. I've been there myself. But this is something just to keep in mind if you're going for both avenues. The deck and the narrative have to be different between the different parties.
Yeah, I think the last comment I make about this is having beaten the drum about develop your strategy first and then do the grants derived from that. The flip side of that advice or that maxim is once you decide what you're doing, do it hard. Like there's no way to kind of theorize yourself through your financing, right? You just start writing the grants, you start pitching your investors, and you see what happens. And I think you get the best advice you can, which institute, which projects, which, funding mechanisms, which venture funds, which angel networks, and then you just go. And Kirk is right. Some people are not going to get funded, and some things are not going to be competitive. But the only way you actually know is if you write the proposal and you see what comes back. So there's a decision point where you decide, am I going to start my company or not? And you make that decision. And once you say, I'm going to go, you just go and you see what happens, right? You get the no's from the investors, you get the no's from the granting agencies. You turn around and say, all right, I got to resubmit. I got to go out and pitch again. I got to go find new investors. And that's what the job is.
Great. Well, with that, really want to thank everyone who joined us on LinkedIn, and especially those who asked the great questions. Want to thank our panelists for joining us for this live portion. So Ricky, Vineet, Stacy, and Kirk, thank you all so much for joining us here today. This will end our live portion, but just want to give a quick plug for next week's MedTech Innovator Live webinar. So we're going to be looking at the light at the end of this funding tunnel and what to do to get there. So it'll be acquired taste, what strategics really want in medtech. So we've got 3 strategics coming. So Bjorn Mehta from J&J, Virginia Giddings from Edwards Life Sciences, and Matthew Schopp from Zimmer Biomet. And then we have an amazing alum, Jennifer Freed from our MTI program that has led an acquisition herself, joining to give that perspective. And also got Jim West here from our BioTools Innovator program to give a preview for next week for them.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, well, we're going to be doing boardrooms, how to manage boards. We call it, what do we call it? Keeping it above board in the boardroom. Keeping it above board in the boardroom. So that's going to be what we're talking about. We got some entrepreneurs